In the piney woods of Levy County, Florida, stood a small community called Rosewood. At first glance, Rosewood looked like any other southern town in the early 1900s. But beneath its quiet charm, it held something rare and powerful: independence. Rosewood was a predominantly black town, born out of perseverance and pride. Families there had built homes with their own hands, tilled the land, sent their children to school, and prayed in churches they had raised from the ground up. In an era when Jim Crow segregation suffocated nearly every aspect of black life, Rosewood stood as a symbol of resilience. It was not a large place, perhaps no more than 24 families at its peak, but what it represented was larger than life. Life in Rosewood was modest but steady. The nearby timber industry provided work, and many residents found employment as mill workers, farmers, and skilled craftsmen. The blacksmith shop rang with the clanging of metal. Children's laughter echoed down the dirt paths, and Sunday mornings were filled with gospel hymns that carried hope into the pine-scented air. It was a town built on the dream of safety and stability in a world where opportunities for African Americans were few. But Rosewood's quiet existence was always shadowed by the harsh racial climate of the South. Just 10 miles away was the mostly white town of Sumner, where the social order was clear. White supremacy ruled, and black progress was viewed with suspicion and hostility. The year was 1923, the height of racial violence in America. Lynchings were a gruesome reality, with mobs murdering black men on the flimsiest of accusations. The Ku Klux Klan was marching openly, their hood symbols of terror that needed no explanation. It would take only the smallest spark, the briefest rumor, to ignite catastrophe. That spark came on New Year's Day, 1923. In Sumner, a white woman named Fannie Taylor burst out of her home screaming. Neighbors rushed to her side, alarmed by her cries. She claimed she had been assaulted in her home by a black man. She was shaken, bruised, and her face bore marks of violence. Her story spread like lightning, whispered from one person to the next, until it became a roaring accusation. To her neighbors, to her husband, and to the town of Sumner, it didn't matter whether the details were true. What mattered was that a white woman said she had been attacked, and she said the attacker was black. The truth of her claim would never be clear. Some would later believe she had invented the story to conceal abuse at the hands of a white lover, but in that moment, truth did not matter. In a South poisoned by racism, her word was enough to justify violence, enough to condemn an entire town to fire and blood. Almost immediately, the hunt began. Armed white men gathered in Sumner, furious and restless, determined to find a suspect. They scoured the roads and woods, questioning anyone who might know something, but they were not looking for answers. They were looking for someone to punish. They were looking for blood. Their search led them toward Rosewood. For the white residents of Sumner, the small black town was an easy target. It was nearby, it was vulnerable, and in their eyes, it was guilty simply by existing. On January 2nd, they stormed into Rosewood. They banged on doors, shouted threats, and demanded to know where the alleged attacker was hiding. Families trembled inside their homes, terrified that a knock on the door could mean the end. One of the first to be taken was Sam Carter, a local blacksmith. The mob accused him of aiding the supposed attacker, though there was no proof. Carter was dragged away, beaten mercilessly, and murdered. His body was left hanging as a warning, his life extinguished by hatred. His death was the first, but it would not be the last. Panic spread through Rosewood like wildfire. Mothers urged their children to be silent. Fathers gathered what little protection they could, and whispers of escape began to circulate. Some families fled into the dense swamps surrounding the town, hoping the thick brush and murky waters would conceal them. Others clung to their homes, unwilling to abandon everything they had built. But the mobs were swelling. Cars and trucks full of armed men poured in from surrounding counties. Rumors of the assault had spread far beyond Sumner, drawing white men who had no connection to the story but craved the chance to spill black blood. By the third day, the mob had grown into an army. Rosewood was encircled by men carrying rifles, pistols, and torches. The siege had begun. Gunfire shattered the silence of the town. Bullets ripped through walls, sending splinters flying. Families huddled under tables and behind beds, praying the wood would shield them. The air filled with screams and the sharp cracks of rifles. And then came the fire. House by house, Rosewood was set ablaze. Flames licked the walls, smoke darkened the sky, and the roar of burning timber echoed for miles. The mob did not care if homes were occupied. They set fire to everything: churches, schools, stores, and houses. The town that had once been a haven of peace was consumed in an inferno of hate. The survivors ran for their lives. Through the night, women and children fled into the swamps, their hearts pounding with fear. The swamps offered a grim refuge. Snakes slithered through the dark waters, mosquitoes swarmed, and the mud pulled at their legs with every step. Parents whispered desperate instructions to their children. Do not cry. Do not make a sound. They will hear us. Silence became a weapon of survival. Babies were hushed against their mothers' chests as families crouched in the shadows, listening to the distant shouts of men hunting them. Some families were betrayed by those they had once trusted. Neighbors who might have offered help instead turned them away, too fearful or too complicit to act. But there were also stories of quiet heroism. A few sympathetic white families risked their lives to hide or transport survivors, sneaking them onto trains or leading them through back roads to safety. These rare acts of courage flickered like candlelight in the overwhelming darkness. The violence raged for nearly a week. By the time it ended, Rosewood was gone. Dozens were dead. The exact number never confirmed, because so many bodies were buried in haste or left where they fell. Survivors scattered, carrying nothing but their lives and their grief. The land they had owned, the homes they had built, the history they had carved into the soil of Florida, all of it reduced to ashes. And then came the silence. For decades, the Rosewood Massacre was almost forgotten. Survivors were too traumatized to speak openly about it, and those who lived nearby chose to bury the truth. Newspapers at the time reported only fragments, framing the massacre as a race riot rather than the calculated destruction it truly was. The world moved on, leaving Rosewood's story smoldering in the shadows of history. Children of survivors grew up never knowing why their families had fled in the dead of night. Entire generations were robbed not only of their inheritance, but also of their history. It was not until the 1980s that Rosewood's story began to emerge again. Survivors, now elderly, began to speak about what had happened. Their testimonies painted a picture of horror. The night raids, the burning homes, the desperate flights into the swamp. Their voices cracked with age but carried the weight of truth that could no longer be denied. Journalists, historians, and filmmakers began to piece together the fragments, uncovering a crime that had been deliberately buried. The reckoning came slowly, But it came. In 1994, more than 70 years after the massacre, the state of Florida formally acknowledged the atrocity. Lawmakers passed a bill to compensate survivors and their descendants, one of the first instances of reparations in U.S. history. But no amount of money could undo what was lost. No check could rebuild the homes, the schools, the churches, or the dreams reduced to cinders. Today, Rosewood remains a scar on America's conscience. The land where the town once stood is quiet, reclaimed by nature. But if you stand there long enough, you might imagine the sounds that once filled the air, the hammering in the blacksmith's shop, the songs of children playing, the hymns rising from the church. And if you listen more closely, you might also hear the echoes of gunfire, the crackle of flames, and the cries of families running through the dark. The Rosewood Massacre is more than a story of destruction. It is a story of survival. Families who fled carried their memories and passed them down, ensuring the truth was not completely erased. It is a story of silence, how America tried to bury the evidence of its own cruelty. And it is a story of reckoning, showing how long it can take for justice, even in its smallest form, to arrive. But above all, it is a warning, a reminder of how quickly lies and hatred can spiral into violence, of how communities can be erased overnight, and of how fragile justice can be in the face of unchecked rage. Rosewood's ashes are not just history. They are a mirror. They ask us to look at ourselves, at our society, and to ask whether we have truly learned or whether the same spark could one day ignite again.